wasn't actually, I thought I was just going to sit back and be bombarded with questions. So, but I will talk briefly, okay? And then we'll go from there. All right, I'll just cover a few things, and then we'll just have more time for questions and throwing tomatoes at me virtually. Okay, so let me see if I can get this screen share to work. Can you see that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let me see if I can replay. So I'm not going to show all these slides. I'm just going to tell you what's been worrying me and then how we try to deal with it. Okay. Tell me if you can you still see? Okay. All right. So let me go through this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about hemiparesis and sort of try and make the case that it's actually a very complicated movement disorder and that we have done, you know, there's been too much pragmatic attempts to deal with it without enough deep dive into its underlying mechanisms, and it's caused us to get into trouble, I think. So I will rush through some of the things that I talk about in that chapter and beyond, actually. Some of that, what I'll talk about, was actually in chapter 2, but that's okay. I know you've all read the book from cover to cover. All right. Let me see. Okay, so that's the book. This is BlamLab. You can find publications, and thank you very much for mentioning the New Yorker profile. Of course, you've made it in science if you get profiled in the New Yorker. Hopefully you'll see that there are other sort of more serious things than that. And then the book itself, okay. The cover actually was done by an artist from Carter, actually. So MIT were actually quite happy that we got to design everything from the color, the font, and the drawing, so their art department didn't have to do it. Anyway, so I'm going to go back sort of almost over a century to the fact that it was appreciated very early on that stroke was really two diseases, right? It was two things. It was sort of negative, sort of loss of control, and positive, the emergence of lower symptoms. And Hewlin Jackson was very interested in this, but was the one who coined negative and positive symptoms. So negative can be loss of strength and dexterity. Positive can be the intrusion of synergies and spasticity and postural abnormality, right? And then, you know, F.M.R. Walsh, another neurologist at Queen Square, a little bit later in the 20th century, talked about this dual nature of hemiplegia, the combination of loss of voluntary movement and the intrusion of these positive phenomena. Okay, and that's what haunts us actually in human stroke, is that we have this problem. Okay, and it may not be, you know, I talk about this in the book, is the term extrapyramidal, that is actually now the sort of colloquial term for movement disorders, came from the fact that when they were making monkey models in parallel to the work of Hewlin Jackson and F.M.R. Walsh in humans, that they couldn't, with a pyramidal lesion in the monkey, recreate the positive symptoms. Okay, and so the term extrapyramidal came from the mystery that the source of the positive symptoms that are so prominent in humans must be extrapyramidal, because they couldn't reproduce them with pyramidal lesions. Most people in stroke don't know that history, actually. And it's actually, I think, not just an academic history of science thing, it's actually hurt us. So the positive symptoms are these resting postural abnormalities and synergies. You've all seen patients with moderate to severe stroke with this at-rest postural abnormality. It's extremely important to be aware that this is before they're being asked to make a voluntary movement. Okay. Now, when it comes to the abnormalities in voluntary movement, there's this famous paper from Twitchell that published in '51, where he followed the natural history in 25 patients of recovery from stroke, even though he wanted to follow more. This is one of those papers you can look back on fondly when we didn't have more authors than patients, which is what happens these days, right? Now, Twitchell, interestingly, was a student of Denny Brown's, and Denny Brown was actually investigating a lot of the postural abnormalities that you could see after lesions in monkeys, including in the cortex. And so that's very inspiring in a way that Twitchell and Denny Brown recreated what was going on with fMRI, Walsh, and Sherrington at the beginning of the 20th century, when there was actually dialogue between physiologists and neuroscientists and clinicians, which we don't really have today. As much as people might protest, I find most people in the rehab space don't know any neuroscience. But anyway.
Can we object to that one, John? This is Catherine.
Yeah.
I just want to present a conflicting view that many people in the rehab space know neuroscientists.
Well, I would actually be happy to actually probe that. But we'll talk more about that. So anyway, if that were the case, we wouldn't have had all the absurd trials we've had up to date. What we had instead is pragmatic clinical trials with very little science in them, would be my view. Anyway, so Twitchell has this sequence which he describes, and really this sequence was really very much focusing on the positive phenomenology, right? In other words, there was an interest very early on in these extrapyramidal symptoms, and this sequence from plegia, which could be 0 to shoulder flexion to elbow flexion to wrist and finger flexion, and then if you're lucky, you can get into the extensor synergy and then escape out the other end. This was really what Twitchell these were his 6 stages. It's very important to be aware that this was really focused almost entirely on the positive movement disorder, okay? And then, of course, what happened is that turned into the Fugl-Meyer. The Fugl-Meyer really was just, and Fugl-Meyer explicitly states in the paper that introduced it, that it was an attempt to bring numbers to the Twitchell sequence, okay? Unfortunately, what's happened is the Fugl-Meyer's become a general measurement that people call for impairment in the ICF scale, which is very unfortunate because really when you consider impairment, which is really weakness, loss of dexterity and motor control, and the intrusion of synergies, it really is only looking at one of those, okay, predominantly, and that was always the intention, okay? Now let's look at the negative symptoms, all right? So the negative symptoms really are, you could talk about them as weakness and dexterity, and if you want to isolate dexterity, which is usually, unfortunately, because of its origin as a term, thought about at the level of the hand, but you can be dexterous with the upper limb as well. And actually, there's a paper that I recommend everyone read, which I talk about in the book, by Sarah Tower, who was this remarkable investigator at Johns Hopkins, who wrote a paper in 1940 in Brain, where she went to a lot of trouble to investigate the consequences of a pyramidal lesion in a monkey. She tends to get overlooked for Lawrence and Kuipers when they published in 1968. Admittedly, they published in more monkeys, but as an actual quality observation and the insights, I actually prefer Sarah Tower's paper from 1940, and where she makes the case very nicely that it's not just about dexterity at the fingers, you can actually see it in the upper limb as well, which was under-emphasized in the Lawrence and Kuipers 2 papers. Now, one of the ways that we and others have investigated dexterity of the upper limb is to try and actually isolate the limb planar so that you can remove compensatory movements because you have so many degrees of freedom in 3D. Weight support, as we know, from Jules DeWolde and other people's work, can remove the intrusion of positive symptoms to some degree, and you can actually get rid of friction. So in other words, you can create not a task. This is not a functional task. This is an assay for dexterity of the upper limb, just like you can use a cyber glove to assay individuation of the hand. Okay, it's very important not to conflate assays to isolate motor control from functional tasks, okay? Now, what you can do is then basically say that a straight reach with a single velocity profile is the equivalent of being able to individuate your shoulder and elbow, just like you can individuate fingers. So it's very important to consider these tasks just the proximal individuation task. Okay, it's cortical spinal tract requiring, and it's just the arm version of the hand. And many of you have seen what happens. Patients can have these trajectories that are increased in variability, they have increased curvature, they have decreased accuracy, you force a movement speed. And obviously what we want is we want you to somehow, in the world of dexterity, to get from the right over to the left. Okay, and the question is can you do that? Up until now, it's spontaneous recovery that does that, all right? Now, if you quantify those trajectories, right, and there's a way you can do that, you can, without making assumptions about particular kinematic variables, you can basically do something called functional PCA, and you can actually develop a multidimensional distance measure of where you are in trajectory space compared to a control reference set. Okay, it's again like an individuation index for the hand pegged to what individuation would be if you were really healthy. And you can do that, and then you can create this distance. And so on the y-axis, you can just take my word that you're getting a distance between the right and the left. The smaller the distance, the more normal you are. This is actually very important because a lot of people will say, well, how do you know that you're recovering towards normal? Either you go back to normal or it's some mush in between, but you can actually say that somebody is moving in a multidimensional space towards normal, even if they don't get there. Okay, which is important for all of us if we want to come up with a treatment, because you want to know that you're going down the right gradient, right? And unfortunately, in our hands, looking at this quality of movement is spontaneously recovers over about 4 to 5 weeks in our study here. Gert Quackel, doing something in a little bit more three-dimensional, found the window to close in about 8 weeks, and then that's it. Okay, and it's not as though it's a matter of the sensitivity of the measure, because in fact, you have all that ocean of white space underneath that you could detect improvement because you've got the controls there. Okay, so this is just beginning to try and isolate in the impairment trio of weakness, dexterity, and synergy, you know, the dexterity component. And there's been nice work showing that this is true, you know, in all the numbers on the dial. It's not just in particular parts of low or high synergy space. Now, I'm going to quickly just show you new data that we've got, where we're basically showing that that if you're careful and you dissect carefully psychophysically, you can show dissociation of the movement disorder from the motor control disorder. In other words, that's very important, because if we're going to ever treat hemiparesis, it may end up being more like Parkinson's disease, where some things like the tremor and rigidity may respond to dopamine, but things like the postural instability do not. So in other words, I would venture that we're going to have to consider hemiparesis a multi-component physiological disorder where each component may need a different intervention, right? To a degree, right? You may also be holistic. Now, I'm not going to go through all this now. I'm just going to give you the punchline, but you know, Alkis Hadjoseph, a postdoc in the lab, working in conjunction with Reza Shadmir, Bob Scheidt, and myself, has been sort of trying to map all these components and the relationship between them. For example, you can measure resting postural forces, where you just passively have somebody rest their arm at a particular place holding a manipulandum, and you measure the forces that they exert even when they're trying to be at rest. So this is like the planar quantifiable version of that abnormal posture that I showed you in that patient schematic at the very beginning. And you can actually map the space of the postural abnormality vectors, right? And you can basically get a very nice heat map of the abnormalities and the directionality of the postural forces. So for example, in the upper left quadrant, you can see that those locations that the patient is asked just to keep rest at, but they can't avoid exerting at rest a flexor force towards their body. And what's nice, sort of echoing in the voluntary movement flexor domain that Jules DeWolde has done, is that if you have weight support, you can actually, if you can see down on the left-hand side, just weight support can begin to reduce the magnitude of these flexor postural forces at rest. Okay, so in other words, you can begin to dissect out these abnormalities, and this is the rest version. Now, what's interesting, and I'm going to go through this quickly because I know we want to be in discussion, is that if you investigate the relationship between those resting abnormalities and voluntary movement, in other words, what is the consequence on a voluntary movement of moving into these parts of the workspace that have these postural force fields? And interestingly, they don't correlate. Now, the reason why that's so important is because if you look at what was originally done with the with the work by Twitchell, and then what came out of that, as you know, with Agnes Brunstrom's book, and she also updated Twitchell's stages and had ideas about how to treat hemiparesis, as did Twitchell. They tended to conflate spasticity, postural abnormalities, voluntary intrusive abnormalities, with the idea that if you could deal with the resting abnormalities, in other words, the postural abnormalities and the spasticity, that somehow that would generalize into the world of voluntary movement. And as many have shown, including Zev Reimer and others, there isn't a relationship between spasticity elicited at rest, for example, with a taut motor, and your abnormalities when you make voluntary movements. So unfortunately, the physiology of rest and the physiology of active movement and the relationship between these components is uncorrelated to a large degree. All right. So I won't go through to Wald, and I'll just say something exciting that Stuart Baker, who many of you may know at the University of Newcastle, and I got a sizable grant recently from the NIH to actually develop a monkey model of stroke to try and go after these extrapyramidal symptoms. In other words, can we do that what Sarah Tower and Denny Brown left undone, which is find out where these positive symptoms are coming from, which at the current time are not seen in monkeys or mice. So it's very important for you to realize that there's an irony that there was a lot of interest in the positive symptoms in human rehab, but you can't get them in animal models. All right, so that's why there's been somewhat of a divergence where animal models get treated for their negative symptoms and humans get treated for their resting positive symptoms, and they pass like two ships in the night. Finally, I just show you something where you can see uncoupling between synergies and motor control during recovery. These are controls making reaching movements. These are chronic patients making reaching movements, and look at their Fugl-Meyer scores. And then you can take acute patients, match them for your Fugl-Meyer scores. And what's really interesting is what Alkes has found is that the abnormality in your trajectories and your Fugl-Meyer scores dissociate. So in other words, you can see an example of this where the patient here, for example, has a Fugl-Meyer of 29.5, in other words, considerably worse than this patient with a Fugl-Meyer of 42. As you know, the higher the Fugl-Meyer, the better you are. And yet their trajectories are more accurate than the trajectories of the patient with a higher Fugl-Meyer score. Okay, so you see a very nice, again, dissociation in the same patients between their negative symptoms and their positive symptoms. So whatever the generative mechanism is for these abnormalities, one can't assume they're all coming from the same place. All right, so, and I would wager that if we're going to do a good job with rehabilitation, whether we do it physiologically or behaviorally, it's this level of granularity and dissection that will be required. And unfortunately, that's not what's been done in terms of using outcome measures that really lump things together too much. And this is some work done on the monkey model, which I will not explain now. This is basically summarizing all these components and their degree of presence in monkeys versus mice versus humans. I won't go into that. I won't, for many of you know these results in the mouse, but I'm just going to show you very quickly, something else that's very important, which is, you can teach a mouse to be quite dexterous. You can then give it a stroke. You can then give it a stroke and show a dramatic reduction in its dexterity. Then you can sort of recapitulate rehab in the human world, which is you delay, and then you don't give very much. And as in humans, you never get back, right? Even though you do 3 weeks of more intense rehab, arguably, than any human gets. But if you don't delay and you really throw the kitchen sink at them, you can go back to normal. This is what we'd like to see in humans, okay? It's very interesting that we've known these kind of results, and I talk about them in the book, for about a century, and the rehab profession ignored them, right? It was never the real intention of the rehab profession to to do reversal of injury like this, because it's very difficult. You can't spend, 4 or 5 hours with the patient within the first 5 days of stroke. It was just the path not taken, right? And I'll skip over this cool result. I mean, just to show that you can reopen the window in a mouse by delaying, as we did before, finding that they can't recover, giving them another stroke, and then suddenly you can treat them for their first stroke by reopening the window so that you can actually get rid of the initial deficit, even though their infarct is actually larger here. Very dramatic result, okay? Suggesting again that there is a critical period. And this kind of result has also been shown, by the way, and I talk about this in the book, in the monkey as well. This is an elaborate slide. I won't go into it at all, but suffice to say that you can get the kind of result that we showed in the mouse. It's been shown in the monkey as well, okay? But again, even though these results have been around for quite a long time, they were essentially ignored. And so it led to a sort of theory that we wrote out in sort of pseudo equation form in the book, which is if you want restitution, in other words, real repair, then you need to have a behavioral dose. You need to have some residual neural representation. There's no such thing, by the way, and we can talk about that as reorganization, okay? It's a myth that has been perpetuated for too long. And then you have a level of plasticity that is greater early than late. So in other words, you can, therefore, if you like in the classic Randy Nudo experiments, small lesion in motor cortex, you have a lot of residual hand representation available, the plasticity is high early, you give a behavioral dose as Randy did, and you can get restitution. And I would challenge you actually that you can't use this simple equation to explain all current results in humans and in monkeys and in rodents. We can talk about that too. So the challenge remains to reverse the positive and negative symptoms, not just compensate. Perhaps going early is one way forward. Okay, one thing that we may have on our side is to go early. All right. And so the idea we had, and I'll finish here and just show you the dolphin, is that, how do you take these three components that have been around for about 75 years? And I can see that Susan's on the line here, and she and I have been talking about this, which is how do you combine enrichment, in other words, a fun environment rather than the morgue-like atmosphere of hospitals, plus cardiovascular challenge, plus training of the kind that I've been talking about. So I would venture that what we need, and we still haven't achieved, is A, B, and C together in humans. Fun, cardiovascular, and motor skill requiring, okay? I won't talk about enrichment, I won't talk. So basically we thought one way to do that enrichment in a human would be to actually have you be in a game as a character in an animation, all right? So what would an enriched environment for patients look like, and how can we promote playful, non-task-based exploratory behavior? Because the interesting thing, by the way, about the entire literature in monkeys and rodents is that in those experiments going back to 1917 with Sherrington, the goal was never to accomplish the task. It was to look normal in terms of your movements, okay? So in other words, one way we thought to remove any tendency to move towards a functional task is to have you make movements where there is no functional task, all right? And this is, oh, I'm gonna just quickly plug in my battery before I go out, hold on. There you go. Sorry about that. So we wanted to make animation. I'm just going to show you an example of it. So we tried to do a trial, and it's extremely painful, right? At 3 sites to get people within 5 weeks of their stroke, and then get them to do an hour in the morning, an hour in the afternoon, twice, 5 days a week for 3 weeks, right? So they were covering about 1 mile to 2 miles of dolphin space, as you'll see. But we also had a control group where the therapist had to do 2 hours time on task every day, also 5 days a week for 3 weeks. Okay, sort of Nick Ward, Janice Daly, sort of huge doses of regular therapy of the upper limb. Instead of the, let's say 11 minutes that Catherine has talked about, they actually did 2 hours time on task, 5 times a week, and then a regular control group. That's me. I'll get rid of me as quickly as possible. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. It's always fun to see what the animation looks like for those you haven't seen. So the goal here is that the patient is steering. It's in a room where you're doing full body movements as well. And it has an AI. So you do this 2 hours a day. So imagine having a squash lesson twice a day for 5 days, 3 weeks. Can you imagine? Anyway, it gets more challenging, needless to say. Oops. So here's the interesting thing. Okay, so here's the result. It actually comes out in NNR this week, the results, okay? Here's the very interesting thing. So in other words, we took a look at and we used, because we sort of had to, we have kinematics as well, obviously, these 2 outcome measures, the ARAT and the Fugl-Meyer, okay? Now, this is very interesting. So in other words, the blue, what you're seeing is we had, because Gert Quackel did this with us, we had lots and lots of well-quantified regular rehab sessions in the same time window as our 2 active control groups, okay? So we were able to sample over and over again age and initial impairment matched patients getting 3 weeks of upper limb therapy compared to our 2 intense groups, all right? And it's very important for you to see that, people spontaneously recover in this time period. So you can see that, you can go over 10 points, just under 10 points spontaneously. Right? The average was about 7 points in the group that got regular therapy, okay? And the 2 intense groups, the sort of Janice Daly, Nick Ward control group and our Dolphin group, doubled that for the ARAT, okay? So in other words, this was the acute version of the claims being made by the groups doing many hours of chronic. We did it as well in acute, and the game did it, which is kind of fun in so much that, unlike robots, this new treatment did as well as giving 2 hours of dedicated upper limb therapy. And I think that has very nice implications for scalability and for fun. And we have qualitative studies suggesting that they enjoyed it more. But just like Gert Quackel's explicit study, the Fugl-Meyer did not change above spontaneous recovery, okay? Now Kathy Stineer and Winston Biblo are doing a 150 patient study with this protocol that started, I think, this week in New Zealand. And it may well be that we were underpowered in this small study to show an effect, but I have a suspicion that we're going to see dissociations between negative symptoms, which I think the ARAT is the closest, even though it can be contaminated somewhat by compensation, to the kind of food well and other type activities that are done in monkeys. Then it requires prehension versus the Fugl-Meyer, which is mainly about positive symptoms. So I'm not going to be nihilistic here, and maybe if we do more early and we find something, but I have a creeping suspicion that we're going to find ourselves in humans challenged by the fact that the ability to respond to high intensity training of the kind done in monkeys and in rodents will respond for the negative symptoms, but maybe more recalcitrant when it comes to the positive ones. So in other words, the deficit disorder might follow the animal models, but the movement disorder, which, unless my grant with Stuart Baker proves otherwise, which isn't present in animal models, is recalcitrant in humans, okay? So it may be a little bit like negative and positive symptoms in schizophrenia, those symptoms in Parkinson's disease which respond and those that don't. We may have to find something else to target at least on top of spontaneous recovery, the positive symptoms. So why is restoration of motor control in the upper limb after stroke so hard? Well, there's a critical period that closes. It's a deficit disorder and a movement disorder. Synergies are particularly recalcitrant. Chronically unclear if training alone leads to true recovery. I've mentioned Nick Ward and Janice Daly. So I have a suspicion that stroke, especially chronic stroke, depending on what Kathy and Winston find, is going to have its DBS moment, just like Parkinson's did. I do not think, minus really being intense very early, that once you get into the subacute chronic stage, we're going to have to do something in addition to behavior in order to have an effect, perhaps not only on positive symptoms, but negative ones. And I will stop there. These are all the collaborators. I will give a shout out to the James McDonald Foundation, which really led to the invention of the dolphin and those trials. So I'm very grateful, Susan and James McDonald Foundation. And so I'm excited and I'm also daunted simultaneously. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, John.
Yeah, no, my question is not, I'm not disagreeing with what you say. I was honestly quite refreshed by how openly you make these points.
Well, I mean, God knows this is an area that needs it, right? I mean, you know, I reluctantly find myself needing to, but you know, it's just the same mistakes and the same bad science get repeated over and over again. And I think we have to do better as a whole field, you know, and I include myself. I mean, I think we all have to do better, but we've gotten into this trap of pragmatic trials for millions of dollars. And, you know, we keep coming up essentially empty-handed. And I think we just need to stop and rethink all of this, right? Come up with better measures, better theories, better approaches, take a look at over a century of science, and I have to tell you, very good friends of mine in this field told me after they read the historical chapters in the book that they had not been aware of these kind of dramatic findings. Okay, and that must be true to some degree, because otherwise we would have been trying to repeat what we saw in the animal studies for much longer than we have, right? They've been around for over a century, right? So, and now, you know, I'm suggesting reasons why it is difficult, right? That humans have these positive and negative symptoms which are hard to reproduce in animal models, and they may be at the heart of why it's so difficult is we have a more complex disorder from the get-go when we lesion the CST in humans, right?
Yep, thank you.
John, can I ask a question along those lines?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, by the way, for a great talk. So in the spirit of openness, I don't know, you may have seen this paper that Carol Lee and I and Robert Riener wrote about the consequences of insisting on a single primary outcome measure and things live or die by one outcome measure, whereas in reality, this is a multidimensional behavior. And so one of the things to looking towards the future, which is very difficult to do if you talk to the FDA, is to actually have a more multidimensional evaluation of these trials, because we may be throwing out the baby with the bathwater.
Well, I mean, again, that's one of those statements that, of course, on one level is wonderfully diplomatic and reasonable, and one can't really disagree with it. On the other hand, I think that there's a difference between trying to target the components of hemiparesis as a consequence of a lesion of the cortical spinal tract in a human. And what I would say is that if I had my way, there would be a targeted approach to the hemiparetic components that would be very focused. And then once you are outside the window, whether it's 1 month or 3 months, then all the pragmatic, more holistic stuff that is in that paper should be fully embraced. Be functional, have participation, be in a good mood, all those things. But before you get to that, have your bone marrow transplant, okay? That's what I'm saying. And I can't help thinking that that kind of article is just a special pleading because we can't have an effect on impairment that is remotely impressive And because we've failed to have an effect on impairment, we say, well, what about the whole person? What about the way they feel? What about their function, right? And it's just a cop-out, in my view.
Well, yes and no, because yeah, if you're stuck in the chronic, for sure, but even in the acute, I mean, the fact is that the behavior has multiple dimensions.
I would need to know exactly what that means, but what I would say is that if you said hemiparesis has postural abnormalities, it has spasticity, it has synergies, it has dexterity loss, it has weakness, and you said you could target those components of the hemiparesis phenotype, and you believed that there was a window where you had the best chance of having a consequence on those components of the hemiparesis phenotype, and you threw the kitchen sink at those components and you focused on those, then you have all the time in the world afterwards to start integrating that recovery that is highly focused into all the other aspects that are, of course, important. Can you use those gains in the home? Do you continue to use those gains in the home, or do you revert to habit and use the other side? Of course, I'm sympathetic with all that, but let's fix them first, okay? And then start taking that fairly focused fix and integrating it into their lives, which of course I believe in. But I'm just saying that to me at the moment is the best we have, so we overemphasize it.
John, could you comment on this idea of the fixing and that it's and thinking about a one size fits all approach versus an individualized strategy? I think, you know, the work out of New Zealand, the Prep 2, Winston and Kathy, showing that individuals have different likelihoods for recovery based on, you know, the level of the magnitude of injury. So how do we utilize that information to talk about fixing individuals who are all going to have a different likelihood for recovery?
First of all, the PrEP algorithm is strictly binary. So you're making it look like it's a whole smear of individual differences, where the PrEP is a binary algorithm, okay? Are they going to be poor recoverers, or are they going to be good recoverers? So let's not make it look as though there's this huge sort of scattering when in fact it's strictly binary, okay? Now, you know, full disclosure, we got a big grant in New Zealand with Kathy and Winston to do the Dolphin trial again in a much larger N much earlier. And to your point, they're going to apply the PrEP algorithm, and anyone who is MEP negative or looks like they're going to be a severe plegic patient are not part of the study, okay? Now that raises the question of what do we do with the people with severe plegia? Now, as I intimated in my talk, my feeling is that acute patients with plegia who are going to remain plegic and chronic patients who are severe are going to be like spinal cord patients or Parkinson's patients. We're going to have to come up with some intervention plus behavior to have an effect, just like we've had in Parkinson's and just like we're seeing now with, you know, epidural stimulation in spinal cord injury with Gregoire's work and others, right? So again, this whole notion of precision medicine and individual differences, to me, a lot of the time is just what people say when they can't get big effect sizes, right? We don't talk about individual differences in appendectomy, okay? We don't talk about individual differences with heart transplants. We have a big main effect, and then of course we should worry about secondary and tertiary differences, age, comorbidities, but let's get an effect size first, okay? A main effect that we're proud of at the level of impairment. And then let's start worrying about these nuances. But let's not do it the other way around just because we all deep down know that so far we can't have an effect on impairment.
No, I totally agree with that. I think you got at the exact point that I was trying to raise, is this idea that if you don't have the neural substrate, you can have the most sophisticated intervention that you want to design. It's not going to have an effect, right? I mean, this is, so if we're talking about,
I totally agree. I think that's why we're doing exactly that. We're using PrEP. I think people who are essentially like very severe spinal cord injury, which is really what a plegic stroke is, right? You've really knocked out most of the descending pathways. We're going to have to do something different. And so you could argue then stroke is three things. It's a movement disorder, it's a deficit disorder, and it also can sometimes be like a supratentorial spinal cord injury, and we're going to have to do something else about it. Yes, but it's quite binary. I don't think it's a huge smear of individual differences. Yeah.
Agree.
So there is one study from Dale and McCabe that they apply very large doses of therapy,
Yeah.
150 hours, and then they measure again after 300 hours, and then didn't plateau, and there are changes in the Fogg-Meyer score. So is there?
Yeah, so that's a very, very good question, right? So in other words, we're facing here a paradox, right? One is, why is it so difficult to have an impact on the Fogg-Meyer above spontaneous recovery to the degree that it's been looked at so far? And yet, if you look at the study by Nick Ward and friends, and you look at the daily studies, 2 of them actually, they do seem to have effects on the Fogg-Meyer. Now, here's the point, is that the Fogg-Meyer and the ARAT are contaminated measures. And the Fogg-Meyer could delta for more than one mechanistic reason. So for example, let's say you get stronger around the shoulder so that you auto weight support yourself, right? So that you can actually make a bit more of an out of synergy movement because your strength has improved. Let's say that some peripheral factors have improved, that your Fogg-Meyer has improved. So we're going to go around in circles unless we actually start looking at finer grained measures than either the Fogg-Meyer or the ARAT. Okay. Now it's interesting that in SMARTS-2 we saw impressive gains in both the high activity groups in individuation of the proximal limb and of the fingers. The problem is that that wasn't done in the control group. So we don't know what the magnitude of those changes would have been in a regular therapy group. Okay, so the point being that we don't know what those gains in the Ward and daily studies are. My suspicion, if you ask me, is that there are a subset of chronic patients who are latent recoverers, right? This is something that we're beginning to see in the spinal cord injury literature, that there are going to be patients with chronic disease who don't have severe contractures, dystonia, and other such things, who have residual capacity that needs to be brought online in some way or the other, perhaps intense training. So even though I'm somewhat skeptical about what the change in Fogg-Meyer acutely is versus chronically and whether they are improving for different reasons, if you asked me under pressure what I think, I believe that there's a subset of chronic patients who have latent capacity that responds even to high intensity behavioral care, and it's neural. It's not just strength or peripheral changes. I think there are patients in those groups that for whatever reason, when spontaneous recovery is over, have the capacity to improve their positive and negative symptoms because of residual anatomy. But that has to be demonstrated before I'm really willing, and just full disclosure, I was a reviewer of those papers, so I'm a fan, okay? But it's a very good question, and I don't think we have the answer yet, and we'll never get it unless we don't, until we do kinematic studies.
John?
Yes.
Good morning, good afternoon.
Hi.
Very nice, good, always good to hear your voice. So here's a question for you. Do you think there are any measures currently available that allow one to predict to some extent how much of the negative symptoms from stroke will improve with treatment?
Well, you know, it gets to again, we've discussed this, is I don't think so, in so much that you're going to have to show that you have, when you do a partial correlation, that there's an additional anatomical biomarker that tells you something, perhaps as you're asking about the residual capacity to respond to training, that goes beyond what your initial, very carefully kinematically measured behavior is. So I am at the moment neutral. I don't know whether if I do very careful kinematics of the upper limb and the fingers, and let's say we get EMG as well, I'm not sure that if you do that kind of fine-grained behavioral analysis, that at the current time you'll get anything extra that is neural that will predict their response to training. Other than the discussion I just had, where you want to remove people who are plegic and are in that other binary of the PrEP algorithm. But I would like to see whether once you remove the MEP negatives, the people who are going to remain severe or plegic, and you do very fine-grained behavioral analysis, that you're going to derive any extra benefit from looking at an anatomical marker at the current time, right? But you can't answer that question by using really rubbish behavioral measures and then say, oh, look, this additional neural measure is adding to my variance, because it's not a fair comparison.
What kind of battery would you envision it takes to come up with behavioral measures that exceed what can be yielded by imaging measures?
Well, again, I would be willing to do the research study first and make sure that the imaging measures have the granularity that we think they have, which we can't possibly answer if we use things like the ARAT and the Fugl-Meyer to predict them, because then we're just going round in circles forever and ever and ever. So if we did a really great study together and we had kinematic high granularity measures of the hand and arm, and then we looked at and we added to those really well characterized cortical spinal tract integrity measures or whatever, and we found that we always derived extra predictive ability by adding even to those fine-grained kinematic measures from imaging, then you could say, well, the imaging is cheaper to do, it accounts for enough variance, we can just use that, right? But I'd like to do the study first, rather than us in the rehab world having a kind of cultural cringe and wanting blood tests and CSF tests and imaging, when really the best biomarker for rehab is behavior.
Thank you. I gotta go.
You see what I mean? That's what I would say. But the study should be done, because again, if I was pressed, I would agree with you that there will be markers that are non-behavioral that will be useful to plan how you target the components of hemiparesis. I mean, just so you know, I'm setting a high bar, but I think in the end there will be neuroanatomical predictive power that will help us plan how we target each of the components of hemiparesis. It's just we need to do that work.
Great. Thanks, John. Be well.
We are approaching now, we're like at the end of our meeting, but for if John wants to answer more questions and you would like to talk more with him, we can stay.
Yeah, I'm happy. I know there were others in the chat.
Yeah, there's some comments and questions in the chat as well.
Yes.
Take a look.
Can I ask a question?
Oh, Pietro, hi.
Always a pleasure. I really enjoyed the overview. You really, this happens on a regular basis when you talk. Questions come up where I wonder, wait a second, why don't I know that, or why did we talk about that? And it's about positive symptoms. And you said that spasticity is a positive symptom, right? I mean, does that mean that if someone, and I never thought about this, but if someone with a stroke holds their elbow flexed, is there EMG activity in the biceps? And
Yeah.
If not, why is the arm like that?
There is, right?
There is.
It's as we showed, if you take somebody and you just passively move them across a tabletop, and I ask you, Pietro, just relax, right? You'll be as if you're anesthetized. There'll be no net activity. You'll be relaxed. But if you take a stroke patient and do that, they're permanently trying to flex their arm towards the body. But they're not trying to do anything. They're just trying to keep still.
But a patient with Parkinson's will have EMG activity while you move them, okay? That's rigidity. But once you let go, the arm stays there and there is no rigidity.
But that's not true. And what I'm saying in stroke is that they're trying to rest, but they can't. But it's not a voluntary movement abnormality. They're trying to not move. It's true, same with spasticity. You take a patient with stroke and you put them on a tabletop, this has been done, and you knock their arm with a torque motor, you get extremely highly sensitive EMG at even 150 degrees per second, 3 degrees per second. Whereas in any of us, you have to get up to 150 degrees per second to even elicit a stretch reflex. Right? And if you get that stroke patient to start moving and then apply the torque motor, they don't have spasticity.
Right.
So in other words, during voluntary movement, that abnormality disappears. So in other words, you've got to be extremely specific about what it is you're measuring, and is it at rest or attempted rest or movement, right? But what happened is all the rest abnormalities, the feeling was that if you develop treatments for the rest abnormalities, they would translate over to the voluntary abnormalities, right? It all got smeared. So it's going to be like Parkinson's disease. You're going to go through each piece, and you're going to have to target each piece, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's not clear that rigidity is a problem in Parkinson's. It's not there during voluntary movement.
Yeah, right. But it's very easy to elicit these abnormalities or visually see them. So the temptation to treat them is huge.
Yeah.
Right.
John, I have a question regarding finger fractionation, in your approach, because, like, I really like the idea with the dolphin, and I think this speaks to, like, kind of like the immersiveness of patients, in the therapy. But what about finger fractionations? Are you approaching them as an extra treatment, or how is this implemented in your approach in general?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we actually have a new device that we've built called the Hummingbird, which is now about to enter trials at RIC, at Shirley Ryan, sorry, I mustn't say RIC anymore, where we've basically come up with a dolphin approach for the hand.
I see. So just for the hand, so like the entire arm is support, and you're just doing the movement with the fingers.
Yes.
I see. That makes sense. Have you tried to use it both devices at the same time, or?
No, I mean, this is much too early. I mean, we're working too hard. I mean, at some point, but I mean, I just like to see this work, because the hand is, you're absolutely right, is a black hole, right? And we wanted to come up with something, and you have to do something a little bit different, which I won't go into today, in order to dolphinize the hand. Right. But
that's a term, dolphinize the hand.
The idea is simple. Yeah. But it's a good question. The hand is a real challenge. But
Yeah,
we've
of
thought
course.
about
Yeah.
We've thought
That's
about it a lot.
what we're studying, in our lab, mostly the hand. So that's that I know how much time we spent, like to do like the healthy humans, investigations.
I'll tell you what was interesting, though, that when the dolphin study, that the therapists obviously they had 2 hours time on task every day. They did the hand a lot. In our dolphin study, we did no hand. It was all proximal, right? There was no requirement, and they did as well as the therapists who could use the hand.
Yeah, because that
was really puzzling.
Exactly. Yeah. So at the end, do you really need to focus on the hand? Maybe like the process is like just targeting this somehow.
I obviously, part of me would like to believe that some sort of magical thing happens where you become dexterous proximally. It somehow transfers distally, but I think you have to focus on the hand itself.
Yeah, me too. But yeah, I will keep on it. So I'm very interested, even in this device to take a look closer.
Yeah, but I know that one has to be a little bit outrageous, but otherwise people are just not going to see it. And you have to do something different.
Yeah, correct.
Yeah. All right. Daniela, thank you so much. Pietro, it's so nice to see you, although he's disappeared now, but
I'm here.
Yeah, but
yeah, thank you. There's some questions too in the chat, but I think they're like between comments and questions, so I think we can close. Unless
Uh,
you'd like to.
Yeah, there are people, Catherine left, but she's right that, that not all animal models are going to answer. But I actually said that. The problem with animal models is they don't have the positive symptoms, right? In other words, it's absolutely true. I mean, all along, they've been making monkey and rodent models, and they don't have the movement disorder, right? So Catherine's completely right, right? That you need to actually have the deficit that you're targeting in your model system, right? You're not going to study delusions in a mouse, right? So it's a real problem. I agree completely with that. But anyway, so how come there are all these people from other institutions? Is this some sort of worldwide journal club that you've got, Daniela? I thought this was just WashU.
I just asked for people to invite others, and that's what we got.
All right. Well, thank you very much.
Advertise like
yes,
because I was not sure how many people were gonna come, and this is the first time we were doing, so it was just like,
yeah,
we were in between, afraid of nobody showing up and like having too many people. So
yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate it. All right. Take care. Bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye. Mhm.